Welcome back. This time I am again with SALIH HUDAYAR. He is foreign minister of the East Turkestan government in exile. And there was an issue on which we had to get a bit deeper, that is the issue of China. So that's what we are going to address today. And that in our previous conversation, we agreed that the West should aim to not to pushing Xi in the direction of Putin, but to split them. The question was how, because yeah, it's true that past attempts since the since the 80s and 90s of giving just concessions have not worked well, and I admit it. So the matter is how to achieve that goal, because otherwise, especially if China cannot solve its deflation problem, chances are that Putin could drag China to his militaristic way, and that would be a disaster. Consider that Russia is the second army, China is the third army, but they have wider financial backs than Russia, and any chance of having a war with both of them together would be a recipe for disaster. So, having said that, let's start with some things that are would be reasonable concessions, and reasonable concessions as long as far as that they are reasonable causes from the global south that has been championed by China, but could have been championed by any other country like Brazil, for instance, in the case of Lula, or India, for instance. For a long time, the World Trade Organization, which has a panel to decide on appeals on trade issues, has been inoperative, because the United States so far refuses to appoint the members it has the right to appoint to the panel. That would be a reasonable concession, right? Once and for all, appoint those members of the panel, so not only China but any other country could appeal any decision on trade, which right now they can't.
Well, that's the problematic thing, because we've seen the case of the UN, where China is a member of the UN Security Council. And if we were to give such a concession, we will see the same thing that's happening at the UN. China is at the UN Human Rights Council as well. And this is why there's no mention of its atrocities, its ongoing genocide that it undertakes in East Turkestan. There's no accountability for anything really that China does. It seems that the UN Security Council and all these other institutions that China has been able to get a decision-making seat has enabled China to prevent any criticism and backlash. In fact, China weaponizes it to advance its own geopolitical interests.
No, I agree, but the representatives of the United States don't have to be Chinese. They can be Americans. The matter is that without that panel, if you are India, if you are Brazil, you can appeal, but you will never get a decision. And so China is appropriating that flag, that legitimate grievance, and to present itself as the champion of the global South. So why is it?
Yeah.
What is stopping America?
Go ahead, please. In that context, then I agree. I think the United States and other nations need to give more leeway and allow other nations like India, Brazil, other nations in the global South to voice their grievances, to address their concerns as well. But
Southeast
it needs to
Asia
be,
too.
yeah, but it needs to be in a balanced way where
Hmm.
not one party becomes the dominant party that dictates what's going to happen. Because when you have, if you have only unilateralism, or you have one dominant party, then the other parties are left without a voice, and this creates more problems. And there's also the issue of enforcement mechanisms, which is the biggest problem of the
Yeah.
international community. There's no real enforcement mechanism. There's a lot of international rules and regulations, but no actual body that enforces it. And so it's only, for example, for genocide and war crimes, you only see small African warlords or this and that getting punished, whereas other states like China, in the case of Russia, I mean, to a lesser extent,
Yeah,
you know.
you see both Democrats and Republicans undermining the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Trump even wants to put sanctions on the justices. So that creates a very at least a double standard that undermines the rules-based system. But
Absolutely, and
for
that's
instance,
beneficial for them.
it's also true that we agree on that, that the global south needs, especially emerging markets, which are more interested in protecting their interests, need more participation to be allowed to. For instance, since their foundation, the IMF and the World Bank has been practically the feuds of Europe and the United States. You don't see an Indonesian president of the World Bank. You don't see a Brazilian president of the IMF, because it's practically, and those are legitimate grievances that China would not be able to appropriate if they were not there.
Yeah, I mean, China has put out other alternatives, like the
Mm.
Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, other things. But again, it's the same thing. The global South, in either cases, is getting screwed, because even at the China's Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, all the leadership positions are again the Chinese, not other members of those countries, of those organizations, not
But,
other
but but
foreign
but
leaders.
at least you have, when you have that openness, you have a chance for dispute. For instance, in the case of BRICS, it's true that the hardline position has been Putin, backed by Xi Jinping. But Brazil and India don't want to take anti-Western stance just to please them both.
Yeah,
So when you give the global South more participation, you open the room for this kind of disputes. What we were talking, so when you allow countries to take their own side
yeah,
instead
yeah,
of, or like we were discussing in Southeast Asia, how ASEAN has been ambivalent depending on their own interests, because China has more investment, but the West represents more trade.
yeah. I mean, in a certain way, there's, you could say, the ASEAN countries have been somewhat more balanced on trade issues, but when it comes to other issues, whether it's geopolitical issues over the issue of Taiwan, or the humanitarian issues over the issue of the ongoing genocide in East Turkestan, they tend to take China's position, or support China's position. So there's, of course, these issues, and
But
that's the
but
sad reality.
that's precisely my point, because when you have these double standards, where, for instance, the International Criminal Court should be respected when it goes after some African warlord, but not when it goes after Bibi Netanyahu. When you have when the global south and emerging economies are allowed to participate in trade but not to have a say in the institutions, you give room for the charge of hypocrisy. And then when it comes the issue of human rights, then those those countries have a right to be skeptical, and then probably are going to prefer their economic interests and side with China instead of the United States, because the
Yes,
United States itself is undermining its own institutions.
exactly. And I mean, it's enacting certain policies or taking a certain direction that effectively undermines that. Even like if you look at it from the perspective of, the U.S. current administration, it claims that it's going to be tougher on China, or that it's in a strategic competition with China. Yet it's dissolving many of the elements and opposing certain policies, like withdrawing from the Human Rights Council is not going to help you compete against China. That's only going to give China more space. Pushing back against the International Criminal Court, if it was the smart thing for the U.S. and other Western countries would be to say, hey, okay, ICC, if you want to be really impartial, if you want to do your job properly, okay, then you need to investigate all crimes against humanity and genocide, not just the ones happening in Africa, not just the ones happening in the Middle East, but also the ones happening in Asia, like the ones that China is doing. If you claim to be upholding it, that this is what you need to do, but we don't see that, which is very disturbing, because this if the in opposing the ICC, the U.S. actually helps China. It helps the regime in Beijing, because the regime in Beijing, they're like, okay, if there's no accountability for this genocide, this crimes, we're going to continue. And just today, a news article was published, an investigation article, um, investigative report on the fact that China is expanding its organ harvesting centers in East Turkestan. So it has 3. By 2030, they want to expand it to an additional 9. And our people, it's against our religion to give up your organs. You don't, even after you die, you don't donate your organs. China, what it's been doing is, in the camps, it's been taking our people's organs, killing them, and harvesting their organs. And now they're expanding these organ harvesting facilities. And because there's no international, other than some statements of condemnation by the West, there's no meaningful action. The ICC is not investigating it. The UN is not because again, China is at the UN Security Council and at the UN Human Rights Council. China is able to continue with carrying out crimes against humanity with impunity. And the West, its thing that it's doing is it's condemning it, but then at the same time, it's not doing meaningful action, and the abilities, the institutions that are able to take meaningful action, you don't see the US and other countries there. On the contrary, the
How
US is opposing.
how that meaningful action should look like?
Well, for example, meaningful action means, if they in other instances, in other crimes that happen in other places, meaningful action means like sustained economic and political, um, pressure and punishment. For example, sanctions on officials, boycotting, sanctions on their economic ability, supporting investigations and tribunals to hold them accountable. For example, in the case of Russia, as I mentioned last time, in 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 2023, I believe, the ICC put out an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin for the forced abduction of some 25,000 Ukrainian children. Yet, when it
About 20,000, I believe.
yeah,
But yeah,
20 to 25,000 Ukrainian children. In the case of East Turkestan, for example, China is not getting any accountability. China's not being held accountable in any sense. Xi Jinping doesn't have an arrest warrant. Even though the fact that the Chinese government itself, its own state media and others stated that they have over a million, they've forcibly separated over 1 million Uyghur children from their families and put them into state-run orphanages and so-called boarding schools where they're becoming indoctrinated to become Chinese. The fact that forced organ harvesting is a crime, but China is doing it on a mass industrial scale because there's no accountability. Just a couple of days ago, China appointed a new Communist Party secretary in East Turkestan. And this new secretary, he was the deputy chief of China's United Front Work Department, which is the CCP's intelligence and influence operation organization, agency, you could say. It's an intelligence agency. And he was the head of the China's State Ethnic Affairs Council, which again tries to dissolve any the ethnic identities of non-Chinese peoples, like in the case of East Turkestan, in the case of Mongols in Tibet, in Mongolia, in southern Mongolia, the Tibetans in Tibet. And so they're positioning this guy. And as soon as he comes out, China announces that they're going to expand organ harvesting centers across East Turkestan from 3 to 9 by 2030. Our people are not voluntarily giving up their organs, which means that they're being killed. And already investigative reporters
not necessarily. I have not followed much of what happens in Xinjiang, but even if they were not killed, because I don't have news. The issue that has been covered more widely mainstream media is the re-education camps, and that is bad enough. Now,
so the so-called re-education camps are essentially concentration camps. It's if you the people there are being, forcibly indoctrinated to become Chinese, stripped of their language, their identity, their culture. The young ones, the healthy ones, they're being selected. And this is where you look. As soon as the re-education camp started, China's organ transplant rates.
Yes, I have condemned that in the case of Ukraine, so I condemn that in the case of China too. Now, when it comes to the kind of punitive measures, if you tell me, for instance, we should fund criminal investigations like the ones that started about the 20 or 25, as far as I know, there is about 25,000 children kidnapped by Putin. And I agree, because you are not because you expect to get Xi Jinping into a trial, but before public opinion, that would undermine in a very important way the diplomatic approaches Xi Jinping has directed to the global South. So that would hurt. So those kind of charges probably are not going to have much effect in Venezuela, but they are going to have much more effect in India, or probably not in India, but they will have in Brazil or Indonesia or some other country. So that will undermine the Chinese diplomacy. If you tell me, if you are in the investigation and you are not collaborating with that investigation, you are not allowed to appoint members to international organizations like the World Trade Organization, World Bank, or IMF. I understand you are blocked from appointing people on those organizations because you are not collaborating with the investigation. That implies bad faith. But when it comes to economic sanctions, my problem is that, unfortunately, if you follow the news recently, they have backfired. For instance, when Trump wanted to continue expand Biden's policy of blocking exports of high-tech chips, China responded suspending exports of rare earth for magnets and others. And at the end, Trump has had to recall because in that you're in a weak position. So it ends up backfiring, and in the end of the day, you look weaker and China looks stronger.
Well, I mean, then what another alternative, and this is what we've been calling for, is just, upholding international law, the principles of international law. For example, self-determination. You hear about Palestinians on the issue of Palestine. Everybody across the world, including China, including the US, all agree on one thing, that Palestinians have the right to self-determination, right? Everyone agrees on that.
Well,
China
not everybody. The Trump administration, when we are talking about this issue, just in case, I believe, at least on my side, I talk about these issues expecting something changes in 2029, because right now Trump believes firmly in a hard doctrine of spheres of influence, like Putin, where Palestine or Ukraine are nothing but pawns, or that have no real right to self-determination. They just are satellites that have to abide to their power.
Well, yeah, but officially on paper, they still state,
Oh, yeah.
the official policy is that they still have the right to self-determination.
Mhm.
For example, in the case of East Turkestan, Tibet, Southern Mongolia, we are
Mhm.
so-called autonomous regions. Even under Chinese law, we are so-called autonomous regions. But our people don't have any autonomy. We have been deprived of our right to self-determination. In fact, China goes on to claim that the Palestinians have a right to statehood, right to be independent, and openly, champions it. Not because it really cares about it, but it wants to woo the global South. As you were saying, China wants to gain the global South's solidarity, or global South's trust, and so this is why it puts on a show of showing solidarity to Palestine. But when it comes to East Turkestan, unlike Palestine, East Turkestan, actually, we were an independent country. We existed as an independent republic before 1949. We were an independent nation before. All historians, everyone agrees on this fact. Even the Chinese.
Could you send me just for when I edit? So I must admit I don't know much about the history East Turkmenistan, but if you say we were a country many people cannot find it in a map.
Yeah,
So
well, if
you can send me a picture
yeah,
via email, so in the edition I can add the picture, and
perfect.
so people can have an idea. And that may be under dispute, because probably some other countries may say no, this territory doesn't belong. But that gives give us an approximate idea of what is Turkmenistan, what is East Turkmenistan is, right?
Yes.
Excuse me, East Turkestan is.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And so what we have been calling for is the international community, especially the global South, who most of them were, colonies. Most of them were, colonized by other colonial powers.
Mm-hmm.
In our perspective, China is a colonial power.
Yeah.
Even the name that the Chinese refer to East Turkestan, Xinjiang, new territory. Xin means new, Jiang means territory. That's
Mm-hmm.
what the Chinese call East Turkestan. So from that itself, it exposes that China is a colonizer. So what we need is,
Not as brutal as Putin, but it is. Yeah, I admit it.
if you look at the situation in East Turkestan, it's just as, if not more, brutal. So in 1949, everyone agrees this, even the Chinese agree to it, that in 1949, when the Chinese occupied East Turkestan, after they occupied it, there were not even 5% Chinese in East Turkestan. And that 5% was the Chinese military, Chinese government civil servants, and officials that they had sent to colonize East Turkestan and their families. By 1960, that population of the Chinese went from less than 5% to over 25%. By
That is also happening in the Donbass, in the occupied territories
yeah,
in Ukraine. But at least I have seen one thing that upsets me with the media is that they try always to edulcorate, to self-censor. I have seen the photographs and censor photographs of people of mass executions in Bucha, Mariupol, and unfortunately, people could not have a sense of of how grave, how serious this problem is, because they are present with photographs that are more adulterated, more censored. But I haven't seen, at least I haven't, anything resembling that kind of bestiality in the case of China, despite its brutality, because the brutality is not only with Uyghurs, it's also even with their own people. Because you see many times the Chinese government colluding with big companies, and workers cannot leave, cannot resign their positions and leave, and they end up committing suicide. So
yeah. So
there is brutality even with their own people,
yes, but
but
the
not the kind
level.
of brutality I have seen in the cases of Bucha or Mariupol.
Well, the thing is, China is more subtle. One, there's no
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
media presence. There's no media presence. There's no foreigners. If you were to go to East Turkestan, there are only two places the Chinese government will allow you to go. Even as a foreign journalist, they invite foreign journalists all the time, but you're kept on a tight leash. You can only go to Urumqi, and only the international bazaar section, where they have dancing people dressed up like Uyghurs. They have Chinese people, and to the west, because the Western media portrays it as Chinese Muslims. So in your eye, if you see a Chinese person wearing this, you think that's a Uyghur, because in the West, what's the media say? These are Chinese Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
But we are racially different. We're from the Chinese, not just ethnically, but racially different. But the Western media, the Western international community, not just the Western, doesn't know that. So what the Chinese do is they dress up Chinese people, dressed up in our clothing, wearing hats like this, singing and dancing, and saying, everything is fine. That's one part, Urumqi. Another part is Kashgar, which is the cultural capital of our nation. But even in Kashgar, they'll take you only to the tourist sites, to the sites that they've built for tourists. And again, it's the same thing. And then they say, see, everything is fine. But if you go 30 minutes out to the outskirts, 30 kilometers to the outskirts of Urumqi, or to the outskirts of Kashgar, you will see concentration camps. You will see these massive complexes with barbed wire fences and stuff. And if you try to get anywhere near that, there were foreign journalists that went there, and they said we had photographed it. The police seized our cameras and broke everything. They interrogated us and said this is off limits. This is the sad reality. There have been few leaks. China is very good at keeping a tight leash on information. That's why you don't see about it, because one, information is not coming out. Two, information is not going in, so nobody is really aware of it. But from satellite imagery, you can see the concentration camps. Anyone can see it, and you can see that there are, even in some of these imagery, you can see many people, hundreds of people outside, shackled outside of these, in the courtyards of.
If you can send me some pictures, I will be glad to include them in the edition.
Yeah, I'll send it over to you. So this is the sad reality, is because there's no media, there's no attention. And China, what it does mostly, it does it outside the major city, in the villages and the camps, which are in remote places, and they won't let anyone come near it. All it does is it portrays this illusion, like this pumpkin city that it has, just like how, North Korean media, it portrays, on its propaganda, that everyone is happy and everyone's great, you
Mhm.
know, the same type of thing that China does. And the reality, you don't see it.
But
But
in the case of China, well, I know it's bad, but at least it's not like North Korea, because North Korea is worse.
no, if you
At
if
least
well,
in the case of China, you know that of protests. These protests don't last long. These protests are, but at least you know there are protests. In the case of
well,
North Korea, there is not even that.
well, in our case, if you look at it, if you look at
Mhm.
news reports, every time we protest, China guns down, massacres our people, and then claims that they squashed a terrorist attack. That's what they do. If you look at every incident, if you Google it right now, like for example, Google the 2009 Urumqi massacre. It's coming up on Saturday. It marks the 16th anniversary. Thousands of our people were killed, but the Chinese government stated that they quashed the terrorist attack. On July 28th in 2014, in one village, they massacred over 3,000 people in one town. 3,000 people. And what did the Chinese government claim? They fought against terrorists and that they squashed the terrorist attack. That's the official narrative. But the few journalists that were able to come a year after the massacre happened, and they were trying to interview people, again, they were stopped. And they said still on the walls of many of the buildings in this town, they could still see the bullet holes, even after a year later, the bullet holes from the machine guns. And again, China
Um, and that
as a,
that that's a point where media would have to improve, because, for instance, in the case of South Sudan, it was precisely satellite imagery that revealed the constant harassment and assaults that South Sudan was subject to by the North. But the media is not doing anything about that. Mainstream media is somebody in mainstream media covering that.
So before there used to be some coverage, but China. So the thing is, many of the media journalists that did go to East Turkestan that tried to cover it, they were all turned back, and then China banned them. China revoked their media access into not just East Turkestan but the whole of China.
But
So
at least at the level of satellite images.
yeah, on the level of satellite images, there's a lot. There's even leaked drone footage
But
of Uyghurs.
what outlets in media are covering that, are following
So
those images?
I mean, before it was like Vox. Vox was one of them. Vice News did a great documentary. You
Yeah.
had Times. You had BBC, CNN trying to get access as well, and they were able to video from the distance, because as soon as they tried to get anywhere near,
Mhm,
immediately they were stopped by Chinese military personnel,
mhm.
stating that this is a no-go zone. And some of them, they had their photographs. They said they had detailed videos that were all too sensitive, that the Chinese declared too sensitive, that were destroyed.
Yeah, and if you can please send me the links, because precisely if you mention something that is outside the mainstream media, people have the right to feel suspicious, especially if you speak about thousands of people killed. But yeah, Times is serious, Box is serious, so those links could help show that.
Yeah,
Of course, Vice. I believe they made one episode about this issue. See, yeah,
yeah. A reporter actually traveled
yeah.
from as undercover. They went undercover, and they even asked the local Chinese people, the Chinese colonists, what they thought. And the Chinese colonists said this is a great job, that The Uyghurs think that East Turkestan is their land, and that that they should be destroyed. This is the voice of an elderly Chinese woman stating, and they have the video as well. What they ask her, what do you we're hearing that China's putting Uyghurs into re-education camps. What do you think about this? And she said, this is great.
So that brings me. So we have covered the issue of the abuses committed by China against Uyghurs, and not only Uyghurs but other communities inside the. Because, for instance, in the case of Tibet, it was not a paradise; it was a feudal state, but it was replaced by something that was not much better than the feudal state. And now, we have seen that moral sanctions could undermine the Chinese credibility in the global south, and their goal is to, in the long-term goal, is to reign in the global south. So those are sanctions that could be meaningful because they undermine it. In the case of economic sanctions, it's not that clear because they have leverage, for instance, in the case of rare earth. So those are sanctions that could backfire, actually, but have backfired. And what brings me to the question is that to the point that Chinese to split Xi from Putin, sanctions are not going to be enough. China is going through a deflation that, because of bad economic decisions, is still persistent, and at some point is going to be too much for the wide financial backs of the Chinese regime. So China needs, in the short term, the West more than it needs Russia. The question is, how can we use that in our advantage to precisely split Xi from Putin, considering that it has to be better than what we have been trying since the 1980s, where China has taken all the gains in terms of growth and trade and given too little or nothing in terms of democracy and respect for the rules-based system. So how, if as sanctions are not enough, in what way can we use that the issue of the Chinese bad economy in our favor?
Well, I think realistically, I think one that's going to have something that could happen is doing a reverse Nixon. So how did the U.S. work with China to undermine and eventually bring the downfall of the Soviet Union? It worked with China, despite the fact that China was a communist regime, despite the fact that there were a lot of ideological differences at the least, if we say it that. But because they had strategic interests that aligned, both China at that time, China was engaged in some form of low level conflict, not really a conflict in terms of military sense, but they weren't seeing eye to eye with the Soviet Union. So the US exploited that. Today, we could see a similar scenario, and I think the Trump administration is trying to do that, but at what extent, it remains to be seen.
What do you mean by a reverse Nixon in this case?
So a reverse Nixon would be doing what the U.S. did in terms of aligning with China to weaken the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that was the Nixon approach. But what do you mean by a reverse Nixon?
Reverse Nixon means aligning with Russia to weaken the Chinese.
Yeah, but that's not very realistic, right?
Well,
Because
I mean,
that's not very realistic because Xi Jinping thinks like a sociopath. But Putin thinks like a mobster, like a psychopath. He knows that he cannot get back to the West because if in 2029 you get a different kind of Democrat from Biden, then he would be in trouble because it would be much more difficult for him to get back to the yuan zone. So he is not going to abandon, he is not going to align with the West against Putin. That's not going to happen.
Well, that's the thing. We need to. That's another issue. I mean, is the fact that realistically, under Putin, the likelihood of this happening is very slim. But if something happened to Putin and someone else came in his place, you could see that, because despite the outward friendliness that China and Russia, or the so-called strategic partnership that they have, there are deep fundamental flaws. Russian strategists, they also fear China. They see China as a strategic threat to their interests, especially in the Russian Far East and Siberia.
Yeah, but
And China,
that's in the long term, and
well,
if you see the case of Russian elites, half of those Russian elites are like Putin or even worse. They are as ultra nationalistic as the elites in China that back Xi Jinping. So it would be practically a 50-50. So I don't believe it's a realistic scenario to bet that to bet on a reverse Nixon. You would I admit that considering all the bad blood that has gone under the bridge, it's very difficult to use economic trade tools to entice Xi Jinping to a deal that at least uh, helps to that at least at the very least uh, keeps the status quo in Taiwan and the South China Sea frozen and cuts the economic support for Putin until he withdraws from Ukraine. That is already very difficult to achieve. Uh, I admit that. But I don't see any other way around. You see the case of the other alternative to weaken indirectly China would be to contain Putin in Europe. But you see in the Hague how the European Union still is not getting serious about defense.
no, it's not. And even the problem is, like, even trying to contain China, or to contain China by pressuring Putin. There's also a backfiring of this as well. We see like the greatest example is in Central Asia. For example, in Central Asia, before the Ukraine war, before Russia invaded Ukraine, Central Asia was more aligned with Russia. But after the Ukraine war, Russian influence has decreased, which is a good thing.
No, it's
But
bad. But I said it in terms of containing the danger of the kind of worst case scenario that would be a war against both Russia and China, and the most interested party in that outcome is not Xi Jinping, it's Putin. So in terms of containing that danger, is that I was saying. But my point is that some economic sanctions are not going to work. Reverse Nixon, even less than that. My concern is how then to achieve an accommodation with China that makes an improvement, not only in the case of Ukraine and the South China Sea, but in the case of the the case you mentioned, the case of the Uyghurs. I still don't have a solution because
there has there has to be fundamental political solutions to this. Um, and I agree with you. Economic sanctions have not been worthy enough. They haven't worked. I agree with you on that fact. Um, but at the same
And
time,
before you complete your answer, is on the other hand, we have the problem that the bad economic decisions made by the Chinese regime has made their deflation worse. what means a problem for us, because if Chinese being the second largest economy, a desperate measure like a massive depreciation of the yuan would be also our problem.
Well, not necessarily. I think what needs to happen is there needs to be some form of economic decoupling, in which Western companies need to seek other alternatives. Because right now, labor in China is not as cheap as it used to be. Right now, the cheaper markets are in Vietnam, Thailand, Southeast Asia, even South Asia, like India. This is where the West needs to slowly or quickly, in my opinion, shift out to. At the same
Probably. Sorry. Go on, please.
And at the same time, there needs to be political actions. For example, you were saying calling
Mhm.
out China for its genocide and human rights atrocities is going to be a moral victory. It's going to be.
Above all, funding investigation, because that's what
Yeah, yeah,
those are the images, those are the stories, that is the narrative you are going to give to provide the people, so the people are not that supportive
yeah, but
of China if you are, for instance, in Brazil.
yeah.
Now,
At the
but
same
what I was thinking is that probably the only in the economic field, the only good leverage you could have is if, and it's linked to our first conversation, is the West started investing more in countries, in areas where China has interest, like in the case of Central
Central
Asia or Africa, because
America,
in that case you have economic leverage to force Xi Jinping to some decisions that otherwise he's not going to take. And at the same time, among those decisions are economic decisions that could prevent the economy from ending up in a cataclysmic deflation, in a cataclysmic depression, because that would be a very worrisome scenario. Depression in China would mean militaristic options, most probably. So
well,
is this economic diplomacy that the West has neglected is the best way, as far as I can see, to put pressure in China and to get concessions in the political field?
yeah. Well, I mean, let's look at how the Soviet Union fell. It was because of economic depression within the Soviet Union, coupled with political movements, political actions, that ultimately forced, what was his name, the last leader of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev.
Mhm.
Yeah, that forced Gorbachev to undertake certain decisions, which then ultimately led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
But in
Uh,
the case of Russia, there were already people in the elite, like Gorbachev, then Yeltsin, who were inclined to that. On the other hand, in the case of China, uh, China has practically purged all the people that came from the Hu Jintao era. So there is nobody in the elite, Chinese elite, that could push Xi in that direction. So if the Chinese regime collapsed, so I don't believe that's the problem with that comparison. There is no Gorbachev. If there were
well,
more people from the Hu Jintao era, yes,
well,
that the comparison would be valid.
you
But
wouldn't need necessarily a Gorbachev, because right now you have to understand the Chinese people are not the same as they were 30 years ago.
mhm,
Most of the Chinese people right now are middle class folks. But if there was economic turmoil within China, to where you have tens of millions of people without jobs, like if they went into an economic recession, what do you think those people are going to do? They're not going to stay at home quietly. They're going to go out into the streets and call for a regime change, a change of their own regime. And this is how you would bring economic collapse within, and political collapse as well.
But
When that
that's a maybe, because there would be a lot of discontent. But remember that in the case of of Russia, there were lots of discontent, and that even the meek people rose to protect Gorbachev when the Soviets wanted to make a coup, I believe, in 1991. But then again, it would depend on the West, because in the case of Russia, the West implemented all kinds of crazy ideas, came from the Heritage Foundation, that only that ended up in the collapse of the ruble of 1998. And then the Russian people that have been so brave and wanted to embrace democracy so eagerly ended up surrendering themselves to the arms of Putin in 1999. So there is my problem is that in that scenario, the problem is that first maybe is the issue of leadership. Will you see the right leadership rise, or probably some ultra nationalistic demagogue? The second is what would be the role of the West? Will the West stand up to do something different from what they did during the Clinton years in Russia, or not? There are two ifs.
Yeah, well, I think given the situation today, anything would be better than what is today. I think that is, at least from our perspective, from the East Turkestani perspective, anything would be better than what is today. Like, it can't be any worse than the situation we are facing. At worst, I mean, from our perspective, China will fall. The Chinese PRC empire will fall. It'll split up like how the Soviet Union split up. At least the four main autonomous regions have a chance of becoming independent. We will most likely be we will, especially East Turkestan and Tibet, we have a higher chance. We will definitely declare independence in such a.
Using that same parallel, you never have a guarantee unless those two conditions are met. In the case of sound leadership, people like another Gorbachev, an economic intervention of the West, because let me take same
We don't.
example of Russia. When Putin came up to power, he just installed he acted like a mafia boss that simply reassigned territories to his oligarchs. And in the case of Chechnya, when Chechnya rebelled, they destroyed the country and put Karimov on top. What guarantee would you have, unless this is done orderly, that a new Putin would not surge in China and put up Karimov in Xinjiang?
Well,
So
so
it has to be the process has to be more orderly, learning the bad experiences from the 90s in Russia, right?
The fact of why Chechnya failed is because the West ignored Chechnya. The Western communities, the Europe,
Well,
US.
I am saying that, but that's a result of the irresponsible way the West pushed Russia to do reforms without accepting economic safety network that protect the citizens. And when you have that kind of irresponsibility, look at Eastern Europe, the AFD, they are almost Nazis, and they have rose to power precisely in Eastern Europe. So when these kind of disruptions are made in a chaotic way, anything could happen. And in the anything is that you could get a new a Putin that assigns again territories and put the Uyghurs under a new Karimov.
I
That's
mean,
not.
we are already in that situation.
Well,
At the
yeah, but that means that in that case the Chinese government may collapse and still you would have no improvement.
No, I don't think we won't face such a scenario, because one, there's too much interest from outside, especially in neighboring countries. They won't allow, they for their own economic interests would not want such thing to happen, to
Yeah,
where
that's precisely what I was saying. My condition too.
is, yeah. So for our respect, from our perspective, there's two real possibilities in conditions that have to be met for us to be able to secure our independence. This is from a realist perspective. One,
Hmm.
there needs to be, either China needs to be in internal turmoil, like the Beijing leadership, or China needs to be at war with a greater power, with a coalition of greater powers. That is the only time we will have the opportunity to gain our independence. In the case of, let's say, China, economically it implodes like the Soviet Union. Our people are going to declare independence, no doubt. Um, but ours might not be as peaceful, like the case of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, all the other stans. It might not be as peaceful. But if we do get into a conflict, like Chechnya, like the Chechens having to fight for their independence, our case won't be like the Chechens. The international community, other countries, won't stand silent to it. They won't sit silent to it. Our own people itself won't sit silent to it. Plus, the Chinese themselves will flee in the event of a conflict. Even in the event of mass protest, the Chinese colonists would automatically flee. Militarily,
The problem is that the chances are very in that scenario of a Chinese implosion without those conditions, a sound leader like Gorbachev and the support of other economic powers. Doesn't have even, as you say, don't even have to be the West. They may be the rest Southeast Asia and
yeah,
Japan. But
Central Asian
the matter
countries.
is that without those conditions, anything could happen. In the case of Xinjiang, of course, if Xinjiang could get independence for itself, the likelihood is lower. But that's not what happened in the case of Chechnya in Russia. They got inside a bloc that was ruled by Putin, that was overwhelmed, and the Chechens were overwhelmed by that bloc.
Yeah, well, one, because the
So,
Chechen, there's many factors, and even in like the status that Chechnya had under the Soviet Union, it was not
mhm.
even the status of a republic. Um, you know, Chechens were still a very small population, and the neighboring countries, whether it's Turkey, whether it's others, the EU, the US, actually opposed their movement and supported Russia. That's why they failed. If they had supported them, they would have not failed. If they had acted accordingly, they the Chechens would not have failed. In our case, we don't see, in the event that even if we have to fight for it, I don't think we will lose. In fact, China is going to be the one to lose, and we will gain more international support if it has to come to the conflict. Furthermore, it doesn't need to be a Gorbachev. Like, China doesn't have to have a Gorbachev. China just needs to be in some form of economic and social and political turmoil internally, whether it's tens of millions of people being without jobs. Like, one of the things, like, so the Trump administration, they initiated the the tariffs, and that
To
lasted.
the best of your knowledge, are there in the Chinese, not in the Chinese, not at the Chinese elite right now because it has been purged, but in the peripheria or outside the Chinese elite, are remnants of Hu Jintao era? Are there alternatives in the Chinese politics that could fill that void? Because my concern is that in the scenario you are portraying, that this void could be filled by anybody, and
No,
that.
yeah, I mean, essentially, it could be filled by anybody. But when it comes to the East Turkestan issue, it doesn't matter which Chinese fills that void,
In
because
other words, do you know from your knowledge of Chinese politics of alternative, even in the periphery, but alternatives to the line embraced by Xi Jinping, or have they all
oh,
been
yeah,
eliminated?
no, there's still uh, influence groups within China, competing factions within
Hmm.
China's ruling elite. You have the Shanghai faction, you have a Guangdong faction, you have different factions,
Hmm.
competing for the trajectory of China. Even in the military, you have different factions. That's the sad reality, or the good reality, if you want to call it that. But their position on East Turkestan, on Tibet, is more or less the same. It's no different. Xi Jinping's Hu Jintao's policy on East Turkestan, compared to Xi Jinping's policy, was just a little bit better, but no difference. Structurally, there was no difference.
But
The
but
end
but,
goal has
but my question is because I am thinking a little bit about Khrushchev and Stalin. So if there is a Khrushchev that may have the gut in China to denounce Stalin.
well, there. I don't think that there's anyone that's going to denounce Mao in that case. If you mean denouncing Xi, if I think the Chinese elites, if they are pressured into that position to save their empire, where they have no choice but to denounce, because that was part of the thing that Khrushchev came in denouncing um Stalin, was because there were fractures coming up within the Soviet Union. So to preserve the Soviet Union, Khrushchev began to take a more lenient, a softer approach. Not because I don't think he genuinely believed in it, but I think that was what the
Mm.
Soviet strategists decided was best to preserve the Soviet Union,
Mhm.
to prevent it from being, collapsed. Because you have other, like the former republics in Central Asia that were under, Soviet occupation. You had others in Eastern Europe under Soviet occupation. There were resistance movements there. So to prevent a a violent implosion, this is the policy that they undertook, saying, oh, we're going to do better. And I think the Chinese regime, to save their empire, their strategists might already be planning for some type of scenario as such. But what needs to happen in our case is, regardless of whether, you know uh, someone lenient comes, the Chinese position is not going to change. Even if you were to bring the leader of the Chinese democracy movement from the United States, who's here, like Wei Jingsheng, and place him as the head of China, and transform China into democracy, their colonial and genocidal agenda when it comes to East Turkestan is not going to change. They have the same view. They want to completely colonize us and wipe us out. This guy openly said that here in the United States. He's the leader of the Chinese democracy movement, Wei Jingsheng, and he criticized the West for calling China, condemning China's genocide against our people, stating that China was doing the right thing, and that the West is hypocritical. If it hadn't been for the Chinese, the Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples were a bunch of backward so-called barbarians, and that the Chinese civilized us, and the West, civilized other nations. Why couldn't the Chinese do it? This type of fascistic ideology. So for us, I think
So you don't see any Khrushchev in the case of China.
no, I really don't think there's going to be a Khrushchev type of thing. I think what's going to happen is there's going to be internal, if the West pursues the right, if the international community pursues the right strategy, you could create internal turmoil for the Chinese, to where the Chinese people themselves are, economically, you know, uh, they're going to be in a recession, and they'll rise up against their own
But
regime.
that
Same,
you have to admit that's a 50-50, because
it is.
you can get even worse people than Xi Jinping.
Yeah, it is. But if you play the cards right, and if you take the right approaches, especially like, for example, in what the West did in the case of Russia, in Chechnya, was it ignored Chechnya, and it should, instead of weakening Russia, it only enabled Russia to, solidify its already flowing empire, because there's
Yeah,
other.
and that's an important point. The role of not necessarily the West, could be the rest of Asia, but you need something that gives the idea of to Chinese people that they are not jumping over the cliff, that there is some safety network.
Exactly. And in our case, they need to, support us politically, economically, and other means, to help us ensure our freedom and security is.
I must admit that I'm not very. I don't know much about the Uyghurs, but also the Uyghurs would have to commit to respect human rights, for
Absolutely.
instance, of the population. For instance, nothing resembling Afghanistan, for instance,
No,
where
no, no, no.
women are practically objects, right?
Yeah. No, 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 no. In fact, we had women's rights long before there was women's rights in China. Our people were, in 1908, we had the first women's suffrage movement in East Turkestan. We got the right to vote. We gave our people, our women, the right to vote before the West had the right to vote. So in
As I
that
said, I don't
retrospect,
know much of the Uyghurs, but that would be an important part of projecting, because the first thing people think when they say Uyghurs are Muslim, Afghanistan, they are stoning women, or you know how the stereotypes about Muslims are.
yeah. Well, I mean, our is like, for example, look, we're a Central Asian civilization. We're a Turkic
Mhm.
people. Look at Turkey. Look at how Turkey is. Look at how Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan is. In fact, ethnically and linguistically, we're the closest to Uzbekistan. Worst case scenario, we will end up like those countries. Worst case scenario. That's like the worst case
And that
scenario.
would be an important way of selling your own cause. How an independent Xinjiang Uyghur nation would look like? It would look like Afghanistan, or it would look like, as you say, Uzbekistan, right? Because I myself don't know,
Yeah, it
and
would look like
I follow
Uzbekistan.
the news. I have about 5 minutes, a bit less, and I want to give you the last word. So please address any issue related to this conversation that you believe needs more attention.
Well, I think, as you were mentioning earlier, I think what needs to be done is we need to reach out more to the global South, and explain what's happening in East Turkestan, explaining, exposing China's true face, because China is the only, along with Russia, you could say, is the only country. As the international community was going into a process of decolonization in the 1930s all the way till the 1960s, 70s, you had a process of colonization in the case of China and East Turkestan and Tibet. Um, so these are the type of things that need to be explained and exposed. China needs to be exposed for being a colonial power, because right now China, the way that it falsely portrays itself in the global South, is that it's a supporter of liberation movements. It's against colonialism. It's against imperialism. When China is the face
Hmm.
of imperialism in the 21st century, it's the face of colonialism in the 21st century. And so this is what we need to explain. And many people are, often ignorant of East Turkestan and Tibet, because one, China's clamping on information, two, the international community, whether it's the media, etc., they don't tell the real story. For example, in the case of the Uyghurs, the media falsely portrays us as so-called Chinese Muslims. We are nothing Chinese. We are completely different racial group, let alone ethnic group. We are Turkic. We're more Indo-European and white than we are, Asian in that sense. We're completely two different racial groups. The name Xinjiang itself, the Chinese name, like everyone, was like, oh, it's Xinjiang. And they use the Chinese colonial terminology to refer to our homeland instead of East Turkestan. Whereas if you look at global maps, before 1940s, 1950s, it states East Turkestan, not Xinjiang, or it just says Turkestan. And Xinjiang itself means new territory. That itself shows China is a colonial power, that it's under Chinese colonization. So we need to push for one, accountability, international investigations to hold China accountable for its crimes, but also at the same time push for decolonization and national self-determination, including the right to independence. In our situation, especially if we look at international principles, we are an occupied country. Legally, we should be an occupied country, just as how Palestine is referred to as an occupied territory. We should be referred to as an occupied country, because up until 1949, we were an independent nation. This is something that many countries, many historians can't dispute, because there's established historical facts. Even 1949, in October, the letter that Stalin wrote to, or Mao wrote to Stalin, because the two collaborated to take over East Turkestan, to occupy East Turkestan. Mao states that he thanks the Soviet Union for helping, logistically in the occupation of East Turkestan. If it was a liberation, or if it was a part of China, why would you need to occupy it? Why would Chinese leaders state that they need this? The term that they use is colonize. We need to colonize so-called Xinjiang and extract its resources to empower the international development of China. If it was already yours, why would you need to colonize it? So these are the fundamentals that we need to explain to the international community and governments, whether it's the governments in the global south or governments in the west. They need to support our right to national self-determination and independence,
I
just like they
am
support.
running out of time, but yeah, it was 1949, 1948 was the start of the new rules-based system, so that should be taken into account. Thank you, Salih.